Prepare for a Revolutionary War story that will break your heart and heal it again. When a desperate mother faces death in the brutal winter of Valley Forge, salvation comes from the most unexpected source. A haunted Continental officer who has sworn off words but not compassion. This powerful tale of survival, sacrifice, and redemptive love proves that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when one soul reaches out to save another. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell for more historical stories where love emerges from war's darkest hours. The Silent Guardian of Valley Forge. Chapter 1. Death in the Snow. The December wind cut through the Pennsylvania countryside like a saber forged from ice and despair, driving snow across the frozen ground where Rachel Whitmore struggled to maintain her grip on consciousness while her infant son wailed weakly against her breast. 3 days had passed since she had fled the British-occupied farmhouse where Hessian soldiers had murdered her husband and burned their modest home, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 6-month-old baby who needed warmth and milk she could no longer provide. At 19, Rachel had already endured more hardship than many women faced in entire lifetimes. But the past 72 hours had pushed her beyond the limits of human endurance. Her feet were numb, with frostbite inside boots that had long since given up any pretense of keeping out the cold, while her body trembled with a fever that marked the beginning of her body's surrender to exposure and starvation. Little Thomas had stopped crying hours ago, his small form frighteningly still, except for the shallow breathing that suggested he, too, was losing his battle against the merciless Pennsylvania winter. The smoke rising above the trees ahead offered her last hope of finding shelter before death claimed them both. Rachel forced her legs to carry her forward through snow that reached past her knees, each step requiring enormous effort that left her gasping for breath in the bitter air. She could hear the distant sounds of an army camp, men shouting, axes chopping wood, the creak of wagon wheels, all evidence of the Continental forces that had withdrawn to this desolate place to survive the winter that was testing American resolve as severely as any British assault. Valley Forge had become a symbol of Patriot suffering, where Washington's army endured conditions that would have broken lesser men while maintaining their commitment to independence despite hunger, cold, and the constant threat that their cause might die with them in the frozen Pennsylvania wilderness. Rachel had heard stories of the camp's desperate conditions, but approaching it now represented her only alternative to freezing to death in the woods with her child. The Continental soldier who found her was making his solitary rounds through the forest that surrounded the camp, checking snares and deadfalls that might provide fresh meat for a force that subsisted primarily on hope and determination. Major Jonathan Pierce had volunteered for hunting duty not because of any particular skill at woodcraft, but because the silent work suited his current temperament better than the constant conversation that filled the camp's cramped quarters. At 32, Pierce had already distinguished himself in battles from Boston to Brandywine, earning promotion through tactical competence and personal courage that had made him valuable to commanders who needed officers capable of leading men through seemingly impossible circumstances. But the bullet wound that had shattered his jaw at Germantown had stolen his ability to speak clearly, leaving him with slurred, painful speech that he had gradually abandoned in favor of silence that protected both his dignity and others' comfort. The sight that greeted him in the small clearing stopped Pierce cold with recognition and immediate action. A young woman lay collapsed in the snow, her body wrapped around an infant in a desperate attempt to share what little warmth remained to her. Both were clearly near death from exposure, but more importantly, both were still breathing, which meant there might still be time for intervention if he acted quickly and decisively. Pierce approached carefully, noting the woman's obvious exhaustion and the protective way she held her child, even in unconsciousness. Her clothing marked her as belonging to the farming class rather than the merchant society that had shaped his own upbringing. But her face carried an intelligence and strength that suggested she had been fighting for survival with remarkable determination. Most significantly, she wore no wedding ring, either because she had never married or because circumstances had forced her to sell or abandon such valuables. When Rachel's eyes fluttered open to find a Continental officer kneeling beside her in the snow, her first instinct was fear that she had stumbled into military complications that could prove as dangerous as freezing to death. But something in the stranger's grey eyes, concern rather than suspicion, gentleness rather than authority, suggested that her desperate situation might finally have brought her to someone willing to help rather than exploit her vulnerability. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that drove snow around them like a living thing bent on their destruction. "My baby. He needs warmth. I don't care what happens to me, but please help him." Pierce's response was immediate and decisive, though conveyed entirely through actions rather than words. He removed his own heavy wool cloak and wrapped it around both mother and child, then lifted Rachel carefully in his arms with the strength of someone accustomed to carrying wounded comrades from battlefields. His movements were sure and purposeful, suggesting he had already decided on a course of action that would provide the assistance she desperately needed. The journey back to the Continental camp took 20 minutes through snow that made every step treacherous, but Pierce's experience with difficult terrain and heavy loads allowed him to maintain steady progress despite his double burden. Rachel drifted in and out of consciousness during the transport, her fevered mind registering safety and warmth even when she couldn't fully comprehend the circumstances that had brought salvation from an unexpected source. Pierce's quarters were modest, even by the Spartan standards of Valley Forge, a single room in a log hut that he shared with 2 other junior officers, furnished with little beyond basic military necessities and the few personal items that had survived multiple campaigns. But it was warm, dry, and private enough to allow recovery from exposure without the complications that could arise from placing a young woman among soldiers who had been separated from feminine companionship for months. Matthews, Sullivan. Pierce called to his quarters mates as he settled Rachel and her baby near the room's central fireplace. "I need you to find Dr. Warren immediately. Tell him we have civilian casualties requiring urgent medical attention." His words came slowly and with obvious effort, the damaged muscles in his jaw making clear speech painful despite months of gradual healing. Rachel noticed his difficulty, but also recognized the authority in his voice and the immediate response of subordinates who were accustomed to following his orders without question. Dr. Benjamin Warren arrived within minutes, carrying the medical bag that had become his constant companion during the harsh winter that had tested his skills against frostbite, disease, and malnutrition on a daily basis. His examination of Rachel and little Thomas was thorough and professional, though his expression grew increasingly concerned as he assessed the extent of their exposure and dehydration. Severe frostbite on the extremities, fever indicating pneumonia, and dangerous dehydration. Dr. Warren reported to Pierce in the clipped tones of military medical briefings. "The woman might recover with proper care and time, but it will require weeks of nursing and careful attention to prevent complications. The infant—" He paused, studying the baby's still form. "The child is in serious condition. Touch and go for the next few days." Pierce absorbed this information with the same methodical attention he brought to tactical problems, weighing resources and options while formulating plans that could address immediate needs while considering longer-term implications. His quarters could provide temporary shelter, but caring for seriously ill civilians would require arrangements that went beyond his personal capacity or authority. "Doctor," Pierce said slowly, his damaged speech requiring careful articulation, "what would they need for the best chance of survival?" "Warmth," proper food, medications I can provide, and most importantly, constant nursing care from someone with the time and knowledge to monitor their conditions. Dr. Warren studied Pierce's expression. "Major, I understand your humanitarian impulses, but caring for civilians during our current circumstances will be done," Pierce interrupted firmly, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "Whatever resources are required, Doctor. These people are under my personal protection." The declaration surprised both Dr. Warren and Pierce himself, coming from motivations he hadn't fully examined but felt with complete certainty. Rachel's desperate situation had awakened something protective in his character that transcended military obligations or practical considerations, a recognition that some human needs created moral imperatives that couldn't be ignored regardless of circumstances. Subscribe for the next chapter of this Revolutionary War story about compassion conquering despair. Will Pierce's silent care be enough to save Rachel and her baby? Click the notification bell so you never miss our powerful historical tales where love blooms in the darkest hours of our nation's struggle for independence. Chapter 2. Healing in Silence. The first week of Rachel's recovery passed in a blur of fever dreams and gradual awakening to circumstances that seemed miraculous after her brush with death in the Pennsylvania woods. Pierce had transformed his modest quarters into an improvised hospital, moving his own bedroll to the floor while giving Rachel and little Thomas the room's single bunk near the fireplace. His attention to their care was constant and surprisingly knowledgeable, suggesting experience with medical necessities that went beyond basic military field medicine. Rachel's initial delirium had been replaced by weak but growing awareness of her surroundings and the extraordinary kindness of the silent officer who had saved her life. She noticed how Pierce anticipated her needs before she could voice them, bringing water when her fever created desperate thirst, adjusting blankets when chills made her tremble, and checking on Thomas with the gentle competence of someone who understood infant care despite his unmarried status. "Major Pierce," she said one morning as he prepared to leave for his daily duties with the Continental Forces, "I need to thank you for what you've done. You've saved both our lives, and I can never repay such a debt." Pierce paused in gathering his equipment, turning to face her with an expression that seemed to suggest gratitude was unnecessary. When he spoke, his words came slowly but with obvious sincerity, despite the difficulty clear speech caused him. "No debt exists, Mrs." He paused, realizing he had never learned her name during the medical crisis that had dominated their initial encounters. "Whitmore," Rachel supplied. "Rachel Whitmore, and this is my son, Thomas." She adjusted the baby's position, noting with relief that his breathing had strengthened considerably during their week of warmth and proper care. "Mrs. Whitmore," Pierce continued carefully, "caring for you has been privilege, not burden. You fought to protect your son with courage that honors motherhood and inspires respect from anyone with eyes to see it." The formal courtesy of his words was undercut by genuine emotion that made Rachel study his scarred face more carefully. There was something in Pierce's manner that suggested personal experience with loss or struggle, though military discipline kept such private pain well concealed beneath professional competence. "Major, might I ask, your injury, was it recent?" Rachel's question was hesitant, recognizing she was probing into personal matters that might be too painful for discussion. Pierce touched his jaw unconsciously, a gesture that spoke of continuing discomfort despite months of healing. "Germantown. British musket balls shattered bone and damaged muscles. Speaking causes pain, so I choose silence when possible." The explanation revealed another layer of sacrifice Pierce had made in service to the cause of independence, not just the obvious wounds that marked his body, but the loss of easy communication that had forced him to find new ways of expressing himself and connecting with others. "Yet you spoke when I needed reassurance," Rachel observed. "You endured pain to comfort a stranger." "Not stranger," Pierce corrected quietly. "Someone who needed help that I could provide." Over the following days, as Rachel's strength gradually returned and Thomas began to show signs of genuine recovery, she found herself drawn into Pierce's world of carefully orchestrated silence, punctuated by necessary communication. She learned to interpret his gestures, expressions, and the few words he chose to speak, discovering that his reduced speech often conveyed more meaning than the endless conversation that characterized most social interactions. Pierce's daily routine accommodated their needs with military precision and personal thoughtfulness that suggested he had reorganized his entire existence around their welfare. He rose before dawn to complete administrative duties that would normally occupy his evenings, allowing him to return to his quarters during the day to assist with Thomas's care and monitor Rachel's recovery. "Major," Rachel said one afternoon as they shared the simple meal he had prepared from his personal rations, "you've sacrificed your privacy, your comfort, and your military routine for people you barely know. Why?" Pierce was quiet for so long that Rachel wondered if her question had been too personal or presumptuous. When he finally spoke, his words came with obvious effort but unmistakable sincerity. "Had family once, wife and infant daughter. Disease took them while I was campaigning with Washington's forces." He paused, gathering strength for the emotional revelation that followed. "Failed to protect them when they needed me most. Perhaps caring for you and Thomas. Perhaps it helps balance scales that have been uneven too long." The admission created a moment of profound connection between them, explaining Pierce's extraordinary dedication to their welfare while revealing depths of personal pain that paralleled Rachel's own losses. She found herself studying his face with new understanding, recognizing the grief that motivated his current sacrifices and the way their presence had given him opportunity to channel loss into constructive action. "I'm sorry," Rachel said simply. "Losing family. There are no words adequate to such pain." "No words," Pierce agreed, "but sometimes actions speak what words cannot." The observation proved prophetic over the weeks that followed, as Pierce's quiet care began to accomplish healing that went beyond mere physical recovery. His presence provided security that allowed Rachel to rest without constant vigilance, while his gentle attention to Thomas created the kind of consistent care that infants required to thrive, despite difficult circumstances. More subtly, Pierce's own emotional healing seemed to progress alongside their physical recovery. Rachel noticed that his speech gradually became less painful and more frequent as weeks passed, suggesting that having people who needed his protection was helping him recover parts of himself that military duty alone couldn't restore. The camp's medical situation gradually improved as supply wagons managed to break through British blockades and reach Valley Forge with desperately needed provisions. Dr. Warren's visits became routine rather than emergency medical interventions, though he continued to express amazement at Rachel and Thomas's remarkable recovery under Pierce's dedicated care. "Major," Dr. Warren observed during one of his weekly examinations, "your patients are progressing far better than their initial conditions suggested was possible. Mrs. Whitmore's pneumonia has cleared completely, and young Thomas shows every sign of healthy development despite his early trauma." Pierce accepted the physician's praise with characteristic modesty, though Rachel could see pride in his expression at confirmation that his efforts had achieved their intended results. The success of their recovery seemed to provide him with satisfaction that went beyond simple humanitarian achievement. As February arrived and Rachel's strength returned to near normal levels, She faced the question of what future was possible for herself and Thomas in the midst of a war that had already destroyed one life and left them dependent on the charity of a man whose own prospects remained uncertain. "Major Pierce," she said one evening as they sat before the fire that had become the center of their shared domestic life, "I need to discuss plans for our future. Thomas and I can't remain indefinitely dependent on your generosity." Pierce's response revealed how much his perspective on their situation had evolved during the months of shared living. "Mrs. Whitmore, Rachel, your presence here hasn't been charity or burden. Caring for you has given me purpose beyond military duty and reasons to hope for futures beyond mere survival." The admission carried implications that made Rachel's heart begin to race with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. Pierce's growing attachment to her and Thomas had become increasingly obvious, but military life and their uncertain circumstances had seemed to preclude anything beyond temporary arrangements based on mutual need. Don't miss the next chapter. Will Rachel find the courage to acknowledge her own growing feelings for the man who saved her life? How will their bond deepen as spring approaches Valley Forge? Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for more Revolutionary War romance, where love grows from the seeds of sacrifice and silent devotion. Chapter 3. Words Unspoken. Spring's arrival at Valley Forge brought renewed hope to the Continental forces and painful decisions for Rachel as she watched Pierce prepare for the military campaigns that would resume with warmer weather. His recovery of clear speech had progressed remarkably during their months together, though he still chose words carefully and spoke with the deliberation of someone who had learned to value communication too much to waste it on trivial conversation. The change in their relationship had been gradual but undeniable, evolving from grateful patient and dedicated caregiver to something that resembled the domestic partnership neither had dared to name openly. Pierce's quarters had become their shared home, with routines and intimacies that suggested family bonds rather than temporary military accommodation. Thomas had begun to respond to Pierce's voice and presence as if recognizing a father figure, while Rachel found herself anticipating Pierce's returns from duty with emotions that went far beyond simple gratitude. "Rachel," Pierce said one March evening as they sat before the fire that had warmed them through the brutal Pennsylvania winter, "I need to discuss the campaign season that's approaching. Washington will be moving the army soon, and my duties, my obligations, will take you away from Valley Forge," Rachel finished for him, understanding the conflict between military duty and personal attachment that had been building as winter gave way to the promise of renewed fighting. "Jonathan, I've always known this arrangement was temporary. You've given Thomas and me life itself. I won't ask for more than that." The use of his Christian name, which had become natural during their months of shared intimacy, seemed to intensify the emotion of the moment. Pierce studied her face in the firelight, noting the strength that had returned to her features and the intelligence in her dark eyes that had grown even more attractive as he had come to know her character. "What if I wanted to give more?" Pierce asked quietly. "What if temporary had become permanent in my heart, regardless of military obligations or practical complications?" Rachel felt her breath catch as Pierce finally voiced the feelings that had been growing between them despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. The admission carried hope and terror in equal measure, hope for a future she had barely dared to imagine, and terror that military life and wartime uncertainties could destroy any happiness they might build together. "Jonathan," Rachel said slowly, "are you asking me to consider marriage? To a man whose duties could take him to his death at any moment? To a woman with nothing to offer but a child who isn't yours and a heart that's already been broken by this war?" Pierce's answer came not in words, but in actions that conveyed more certainty than any verbal declaration could have achieved. He knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his, studying her face with the complete attention that had characterized his care throughout their months together. "Rachel Whitmore," he said formally, his voice carrying the authority of military command applied to personal conviction. "I'm asking you to marry me because loving you and Thomas has taught me that some purposes transcend duty and some commitments matter more than military service. I'm asking because the thought of leaving you behind feels like abandoning the most important mission I've ever been given." The proposal was everything Rachel could have hoped for and everything she had feared to want. Marriage to Pierce would provide security and love for herself and Thomas, but it would also mean accepting the constant uncertainty of military life and the very real possibility that she could lose another husband to the war that had already claimed so much. "Jonathan," she replied carefully, "if I said yes, if we married, what would that mean for your military career? For the campaigns you'll be required to join? I won't have you sacrifice your honor or your obligations for domestic happiness." Pierce's smile was the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him since their initial meeting, transforming his scarred face into something beautiful and alive with hope. "It would mean I finally have reasons to survive whatever campaigns await, instead of simply enduring them. It would mean coming home to family instead of empty quarters and solitary duty." The answer addressed her practical concerns while revealing the depth of emotional transformation their relationship had created in both their lives. Pierce had found in Rachel and Thomas not just objects of his protection, but sources of meaning that gave his military service personal stakes beyond abstract patriotism. Before Rachel could formulate her response, the sound of approaching footsteps outside Pierce's quarters announced the arrival of someone seeking his immediate attention. Dr. Warren appeared in the doorway, his expression carrying the urgency that had become familiar during their months at Valley Forge. "Major Pierce," Dr. Warren said formally, "General Washington requires your presence for immediate consultation regarding medical provisions for the upcoming campaign. There are logistical considerations that require your expertise with supply management." Pierce rose immediately, his automatic military response to superior authority taking precedence over personal conversation despite the timing of the interruption. But his eyes remained fixed on Rachel as he prepared to leave, clearly hoping for some indication of her response to his proposal. "Go," Rachel said gently. "Duty calls, and I'll still be here when you return. But Jonathan, ask me again when you come back. Ask me properly, and I'll give you an answer that will make your military service meaningful beyond anything you've known." Pierce's expression showed understanding that her request wasn't delay, but promise. She needed time to prepare words that would match the importance of the commitment he was asking her to make. His departure was swift, but accompanied by a look that carried both hope and absolute trust in her character. Alone with Thomas for the first time in weeks, Rachel found herself confronting the magnitude of the decision that lay before her. Marriage to Pierce would mean accepting all the uncertainties and dangers of military life, but it would also mean building a family with a man whose love had already proven itself through months of sacrificial care. Thomas, now 8 months old and thriving despite his traumatic beginning, seemed to understand the significance of the moment as he studied his mother's face with the serious attention that had become characteristic. His recovery from near-death to healthy infancy represented Pierce's first success at protecting the family he had failed to save during his earlier marriage, creating bonds that transcended blood relation. When Pierce returned 4 hours later, Rachel was waiting with an answer that had been building in her heart since the first moment he had carried her from the frozen woods. She had prepared words that would honor both his proposal and the love that had grown between them, despite impossible circumstances. "Jonathan Pierce," she said as he entered their shared quarters, "I accept your proposal with complete understanding of what military marriage means and absolute confidence in what our love can accomplish together. I choose you not despite the uncertainties we'll face, but because facing them together will make us stronger than either could be alone." Pierce's response was immediate and wordless. He crossed the room and took her in his arms with the desperate relief of someone who had feared losing the most important battle of his life. Their embrace was interrupted by Thomas's delighted babbling, as if the infant understood that their family had just become officially complete. Subscribe for more Revolutionary War stories where love triumphs over the trials of war. Will Pierce and Rachel's marriage survive the challenges of military life? Hit the notification bell for historical romances that prove the strongest foundations are built from shared sacrifice and unwavering devotion. O Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas. Sonnet 4.